Hello students, today we are going to see Unit 3 in Celebration of Being Alive, written by Dr. Christian Bernard. In celebration, we have to celebrate of being alive. Written by a Dr. Christian Bernard. Carefully look at the spelling of Christian, Christian, Christian Bernard, Barnard, Bernard. So there are several physically challenged people who will have lived successful and meaningful life. Even the physically challenged people who have lived a successful and meaningful life. So here are a few personalities who have fought great odds and lived a life of blazing achievements. Let's share what we know about each of them and complete the table below. So I think this will give you a kind of motivation who are physically challenged and yet they achieved a lot in their life. The first, Beethoven, and he had hearing impairment, and his achievement was in music. Next one is the Demosthenes, and he had a speech impairment. Demosthenes, and he had speech impairment, and you know what? He was a father of oration. Next one is Helen Keller. She was blind and deaf, and she wrote several books. And the next one is Mariyappan Thangavelu. Recently, this athlete was in the news in the recent past, and Mariyappan Thangavelu, he was got his legs stunted, and he was a gold medalist the Paralympics in the long jump. I hope you remember him. Next one is Mozart, and he had hearing defect, and his field of achievement was in music. John Milton, and he was blind. You know what? John Milton was a poet. Sudha Chandran was an actress, and he got amputated leg, and the field of achievement, Bharatanatyam. See, what should we learn from these personalities? From these personalities, we should learn that though they were physically challenged, they never thought about all those things, and they achieved that much in their life. And how are you, dear children? Are you complaining about negatives of your life? Please don't complain about the negativities of your life. Be positive and achieve in your life. Okay? So, with this, we are going to start the story. Let's enter into the story. The first paragraph, before that, this is written by Dr. Christian Bernard. We all know that Dr. Christian Bernard, whether you know or not, know it now. We all know that Dr. Christian Bernard was the first doctor to perform a heart transplant surgery. So, Dr. Christian Bernard was the first doctor to perform a heart transplant surgery. Here we have an extract of his speech wherein he narrates an experience. So, he narrates his own experience, which has changed his perspective of life altogether, his view of life altogether. One incident changed his perspective of life. What was that incident? Let's find out what led to such a dramatic transformation. So this is in page number 67, first paragraph. More and more, as I near the end of my career as a heart surgeon, my thoughts have turned to the consideration of why people should suffer. Suffering seems so cruelly prevalent in the world today. Do you know that of the 125 million children born this year, 12 million are unlikely to reach the age of 1, and another 6 million will die before the age of 5. And of the rest, many will end up as mental or physical cripples. So, explanation of this paragraph. Dr. Christian Bernard is a narrator. He can speak so knowledgeably about suffering because he's a surgeon and he sees people suffering on a daily basis. So, as he neared the end of his career as a heart surgeon, his thoughts have turned to the consideration. Consideration means careful thought of why people should suffer. He has got a question: why should people suffer? suffering seems so cruelly prevalent. It is common all over the world. And he added that of the 125 million children born each year, 12 million, 1 million is equal to 10 lakh, 12 million are unlikely to reach the age of 1. They are not reaching the age of 1, and another 6 million will die before the age of 5. And the rest will end up as mental and physical cripples. What is meant by cripple? People with some disability, preventing them from performing certain normal functions. I repeat, cripples, people with some disability, preventing them from performing certain normal functions. What he says in this paragraph. So here, Dr. Christian Barnard knowledgeably talks about suffering. Why? Because he's a surgeon and he sees people suffering on a daily basis. And he sees children suffers. That's why he says like this. Suffering is common all over the world. Children, even the children are suffering. Before they could attain the age of 5, most of the children are dying. Suffering is so common in this world. So that's what he is saying. Do you understand? Shall we move on to the next one? Second paragraph. My gloomy thoughts probably stem from an accident I had a few years ago. One minute I was crossing the street with my wife after a lovely meal together, and the next minute a car had hit me and knocked me into my wife. She was thrown into the other lane and struck by a car coming from the opposite direction. So all these gloomy thoughts probably began from an accident. He met with an accident before several years. So one day he was crossing the street with his wife after a lovely meal together. And the next minute, a car had hit him and knocked him into his wife. She was thrown into the other lane, and struck by a car coming from the opposite direction. So the Christian Barnard and his wife met with an accident several years ago. Do you understand? Shall we move on to the next one? During the first few days in the hospital, I experienced not only agony and fear, but also anger. I could not understand why my wife and I had to suffer. I had 11 broken ribs and a perforated lung. My wife had a badly fractured shoulder. Over and over, I asked myself, why should this happen to us? I had work to do. After all, there were patients waiting for me to operate on them. My wife had a young baby who needed her care. So, explanation of the third point. So, during the next few days in the hospital, Dr. Christian Barnard experienced, why he was in the hospital? Because he was met with an accident. He experienced not only agony. Agony means extreme physical and mental suffering. What is agony? Extreme physical and mental suffering. And fear, but also anger. He experienced what? He experienced anger. He could not understand why his wife and he had to suffer. He could not understand the reason why he was suffering, why God made him to meet with an accident. I had 11 broken ribs. So the doctor himself had 11 broken ribs and a perforated lung. What is meant by perforated? Torn, damaged with a hole. So he had got a damaged lung. My wife had a badly fractured shoulder. His wife had a badly fractured shoulder. Over and over, he asked himself, why should this happen to us? And Dr. Christian Bernard asked several questions like why that should happen to them. He had work to do. After all, he's a doctor, dear children. He had patients waiting for him to operate on them. He was a heart transplant surgeon. He met with an accident. Imagine the condition of the patients. And his wife had a young baby who needed her care. His wife had a young baby. You know very well, small children need the mother's care. The mother was in the hospital. So, what will be the condition of the child? Do you understand the third paragraph? Shall we move on to the next one? My father, had he still been alive, would have said, "My son, it's God's will. That's the way God tests you. Suffering ennobles you, makes you a better person." Dr. Christian's Bernard father had still been alive, he would have said, "He's not alive." If he was alive, he would have said like this. What Dr. Christian Bernard's father would have said? He would have said that it's God's will. What's God's will? Everything is God's will. That's the way God tests you. God tests you by giving you pain, suffering. That suffering ennobles you. Ennobles, it will dignify you. It will make you morally noble, and it will make you a better person. Who would have said this? Dr. Christian Bernard's father would have said this if he had been alive. Do you understand? But as a doctor, I see nothing noble in a patient thrashing around in a sweat-soaked bed, mind clouded in agony, nor can I see any nobility in the crying of lonely child in a ward at night. But as a doctor, he could see nothing noble. Patient thrashing around. What is meant by thrashing around? It's an idiom to move about restlessly. Patients are moving restlessly here and there in a sweat-soaked bed. Sweat-soaked bed. Mind clouded in agony. It's full of pain. Nor can he see any nobility in the crying of a lonely child in a ward. He could not see any nobility. He could not accept, from this paragraph we can understand that he could not accept his father's belief that suffering was God's way of making people better. And also, he could see nothing noble in a patient thrashing around, moving around restlessly in a sweat-soaked bed, and mind clouded in agony, pain. Nor he could see any nobility in the crying of a lonely child in a ward at night. In those days, they did not have sophisticated heart surgery. I have always found the suffering of children particularly heartbreaking, especially because of their total trust in doctors and nurses. They believe you are going to help them. If you can't, they accept their fate. They go through mutilating surgery and afterwards they don't complain. See, in those days, they did not have sophisticated. What is meant by sophisticated? Well advanced. Sophisticated means well advanced heart surgery. I have always found the suffering of children particularly heartbreaking, especially because of their total trust in doctors and nurses. They believe you are going to help them. If you can't, they accept their fate. They go through mutilating surgery. What is meant by mutilating surgery? Surgery involving removal of tissue even at the risk of worsening of the patient's condition. So here the patients accept the fate. They cannot get better and the doctors have tried their best to help them. They accept their fate more willingly than others because they are children and they trust others wholeheartedly. So, if the person they trust fails, they assume they cannot get better. On the other hand, cannot trust the doctors the way the children do. They assume there is always something more that can be done. One morning, several years ago, I witnessed what I call the Grand Prix of Cape Town's Red Cross Children's Hospital. It opened my eyes to the fact that I was missing something in all my life, thinking about suffering, something basic that was full of solace for me. So, several years ago, Dr. Christian Bernard witnessed the Grand Prix, the motorcycle race, right? Where he witnessed that? He witnessed that race in the Cape Town's Red Cross Children's Hospital. It opened his eyes to the fact that he was missing something in all his life, thinking about suffering. Something basic that was full of solace. Solace means comfort for him. That incident gave him comfort. That incident consoled him. What was that incident? What happened in Cape Town's Red Cross Children's Hospital? Let's see. What happened there that morning was that a nurse had left a breakfast trolley unattended, and very soon this trolley was commandeered by an interpreted crew of two, a driver and a mechanic. The mechanic provided motor power by galloping along behind the trolley with his head down, while the driver, seated on the mower deck, held on with one hand and steered by scraping his foot on the floor. The choice of roles was easy because the mechanic was totally blind and the driver had only one arm. The explanation of this paragraph. What happened there that morning was that a nurse in the hospital, Cape Town Children's Red Cross Hospital, a nurse had left a breakfast trolley. You can see the picture of breakfast trolley, and she left it unattended. There was no one to attend it. And very soon this trolley was commanded, taken control of by an interpret means a bold and daring crew of two, a driver and a mechanic. So the unattended trolley was controlled by two. One acted as a driver and other a mechanic. The mechanic provided a motor power by galloping means running, along behind the trolley. So the mechanic provided the power by running along behind the trolley with his head down, while the driver, seated on the mower deck, the front part, held with one hand and steered by scraping his foot on the floor. The choice of roles was easy because the mechanic was totally blind and the driver had only one arm. So you can see in the picture, one acted as a driver, the other as a mechanic. The mechanic provided the power and the driver controlled the steering. Okay. The choice of roles was easy because the mechanic was totally blind. And the driver had only one arm. Okay. Next paragraph. They put on quite a show that day, judging by the laughter and shouts of encouragement from the rest of the patients. It was much better entertainment than anything anyone puts on at the Indianapolis 500 car race. There was a grand finale of scattered plates and silverware before the nurse and ward sister caught up with them, scolded them, and put them back to bed. They put on quite a show. All the patients in the hospital enjoyed the show. It was such an entertainment. It was like a grand finale of scattered plates and silverware before the nurse and the ward sister caught those two boys, and they scolded them and put them back to their bed. Next paragraph. Let me tell you about these two. These two here refers to the driver and the mechanic. Those boys. The mechanic was all of 7 years old. So the mechanic was 7 years old. One night, when his mother and father were drunk, his mother threw a lantern at his father, missed, and the lantern broke over the child's head and shoulders. he suffered severe third-degree burns on the upper part of his body and lost both his eyes. At the time of the Grand Prix, he was walking horror with a disfigured face and a long flap of skin hanging from the side of his neck to his body. Very terrible story. So this is the story of a 7-year-old boy who acted as a mechanic. So what happened? One night when his mother, the boy's mother and father were drunk, both were drunkards, his mother threw a lantern, a light at his father, but it missed the father and the lantern broke over the child's head and shoulders. He suffered severely third-degree burns, very severe, on the upper part of his body. So the small 7-year-old boy suffered third-degree burns on the upper part of the body because of his drunkard parents, and he lost both his eyes. At the time of the Grand Prix, he was a walking horror, okay, because with a disfigured face. What face? Disfigured face. Disfigured means spoiled face, spoiled in appearance, and long flap of skin. Flap of skin was hanging from the side of his neck to his body. As wound healed around his neck, his lower jaw became gripped in a mass of fibrous tissue. So you might have seen a lot of people with burns, right? The only way this boy, little boy, could open his mouth was to raise his head. When I stopped by to see him after the race, he said, "You know, we won," and he was laughing. See, he had got a disfigured face. He suffered from third-degree burns without thinking anything, and he has got a disfigured face. Without thinking about that, he was enjoying the race in the hospital. Okay? So this changed the doctor's attitude. Next paragraph. The trolley's driver I knew better. A few years earlier, I had successfully closed a hole in his heart. He had returned to the hospital because he had malignant tumor of the bone. A few days before the race, his shoulder and arm were amputated. There was a little hope of his recovery. After the Grand Prix, he proudly informed me that the trolley's wheels were not properly oiled, but he was a good driver and he had full confidence in the mechanic. The other boy who acted as a driver, his story. So he had successfully closed a hole in his heart. The doctor had successfully closed a hole in his heart, the boy's heart. He had returned to the hospital. The boy had returned to the hospital because he had malignant tumor. Malignant, very harmful to life. Tumor, disease growth in some part of the body. Diseased growth in some part of the body. Tumor, you know, malignant tumor of the bone. A few days before the race, his shoulder and arm were amputated, cut off by surgical operation. So he had no arms. There was a little hope of his recovery. After the Grand Prix, that boy whose arms and shoulders were amputated, that boy proudly informed the doctor that the trolley's wheels were not properly oiled, but he was a good driver and he had full confidence in the mechanic. Both those two boys did not worry about their problems. Next paragraph. Suddenly I realized that these two children had given me a profound lesson in getting on with the business of living, because the business of living is joy in the real sense of the word, not just something for pleasure, amusement, recreation. The business of living is the celebration of being alive. So suddenly the doctor realized that these two children, the boy who acted as a mechanic, the boy who acted as a driver, had given him a profound, very great lesson in getting on with the business of living. Because the business of living is joy in the real sense of the word. What is the business of living? That's joy in the real sense of the word, not just something for pleasure, amusement, or recreation. The business of living is a celebration of being alive. Last paragraph. I had been looking at suffering from the wrong end. The doctor had been looking suffering from the wrong end. You don't become a better person because you are suffering, but you become a better person because you have experienced suffering. So these are very important words. You don't become a better person because you are suffering. If you suffer, you can't become a better person. But if you experience suffering, you will become a better person. We can't appreciate light if we haven't known darkness. We can't appreciate light if we haven't known darkness. Nor can we appreciate warmth if we have never suffered cold. These children showed me that it's not what you have lost that's important. What is important is what you have left. So it's a great lesson. Those last two lines, those two children, the boys who acted as driver and mechanic, showed the doctor that it's not what they have lost that's important. It's not what you have lost that's important. What is important is what you have left. So, in celebration of being alive ends with this beautiful story. I hope you have understood the story. If you have any doubts, contact me. Thank you.